I'm very pleased to announce that today's video is sponsored by the Great Courses Plus. More on that later. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. Today's video, the 7 Years' War, Part 2. In our last video, you saw how colonial skirmishes and diplomatic twists started the 18th century's very own World War. In this video, we'll be discussing one more diplomatic reversal that managed to completely change the course of history. Before we get to that, let's start off today's video with a completely unnecessary excuse for me to play with the reverb settings on my microphone. It's 1758, and in one corner we have France, Russia, and Austria, who have been stopping the competition in Central Europe. And in the other we have the Anglo-Prussian alliance, in serious need of a cutman. But considering the fact that today the United States' official language is English and not French, you may have guessed that things turned around for the British and Prussians. You'd be right, but it didn't happen immediately. Frederick had just suffered the greatest military disaster of his career after a string of defeats at Kay and Maxen on the fields of Kernersdorf, a name that would haunt Frederick's memory forever. Prussian forces attempted an ambitious double envelopment, hoping to overwhelm the Austrian and Russian armies massed near the Oder River. But Frederick had used this tactic, a variation of the oblique order, before, and his enemies were ready for it. The Russians had heavily weighed their forces in the center and were able to dispatch reinforcements with ease wherever the Prussians attacked. The battle marked the only time forces under Frederick himself broke order and retreated in total disarray. Frederick's allies, meanwhile, enjoyed a reversal of fortune. After successfully defeating the French in Madras, India, British forces won a series of victories all over the globe. In a turn of events that should be thoroughly unsurprising to anyone who's ever read up on British history, they began to utterly dominate the war at sea. The Royal Navy was victorious at Guadeloupe, Lagos, and Quiberon Bay, decisively extinguishing any threat of French invasion on the British mainland. The ground forces in North America complemented these maritime triumphs. After capturing the newly christened Fort Pitt the previous year, British regular and colonial forces spent that spring securing their hold of the western frontier with victories at Fort Niagara and Fort Carillon, which gave them control of the Hudson Valley. With that front secure, it was time to move north. All summer, British forces under General James Wolfe lay siege to Quebec, leading to the Battle of the Plains of Abraham on September 13th, yet another British success. However, Wolfe would not live to see his officers march through the streets, as both he and the French commander, Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, were killed in the fighting. As 1759 drew to a close, British supremacy abroad had been confirmed, and they were well on their way to supplanting France as the premier global power. The following year, 1760, proved equally auspicious for the British on the battlefield, but also saw the death of their king. George II died on October 25th, possibly on the toilet. That fact is not particularly important, but the writer threatened to quit if we cut that from the script. Anyways, he was succeeded by his grandson George III, who would oversee further victories around the globe. In India, where the British had actually been fighting the French and Indians, Britain scored a decisive victory at the Battle of Wandiwash in January, despite being outnumbered by 2,000. They then launched a renewed offensive, and by September the French army and their remaining allies were trapped in their colonial capital at Pondicherry. During the grueling 3-month siege that followed, civilians died in droves. By early next year, the French garrison surrendered, and the British were victorious in India. In North America, the Redcoats and their colonial allies seized on the momentum that they had gained through the capture of Quebec to win several more easy victories that summer. Throughout the course of the war, French support among Native American tribes operating in Ohio and Canada had steadily eroded. The Shawnee and Lenape had made a separate peace with Britain in 1758, while many of the so-called Mission Indians, those who had converted to Catholicism, continued to fight up through 1760, at which point they too abandoned the war effort. Though some sporadic fighting did continue, that year essentially meant the end of French Canada and the last major conflict in the theater. Unsurprisingly, Native Americans, both who had aided the French and British allies, ultimately got the short end of the stick, but more on that later. So how were things going for Frederick in Central Europe this year? I think solidly mediocre would be a reasonable way to describe the situation. The Swedes took control of a significant swath of Pomerania in January, while the French took Marburg and the Austrians captured the Silesian city of Glatz. That last defeat was especially damaging to Frederick's pride because the Austrian commander, Ernst von Lauden, had once sought employment in his army, but was rebuffed. Frederick quickly struck back at him though, defeating the Austrian forces at Liegnitz in August. The following month brought an utterly humiliating defeat when Russian and Austrian troops captured and held Berlin from October 9th to the 12th. Despite the rather short occupation, it was still a terrible blow to Prussian morale. In keeping with the trend of Frederick winning battles while losing the war, he ended the year with a success at the Battle of Torgau, one that came at a heavy price, a third of his troops. As New Year's Day, 1761, came and went, the 7 Years' War had seemingly contracted and appeared to be making a decisive end. India and North America were no longer the sites of large-scale warfare, and the British Empire had established supremacy in both theaters. In Central Europe, however, the walls were closing in on Frederick. Prussians and Hanoverians looked west to try to stymie the French, but in doing so left Kolberg open to a Russian assault. In December, Elizabeth's forces took the city, Prussia's final port on the Baltic Sea, creating a twofold problem for the besieged Frederick. Russia's greatest weakness, its chronic supply problems, had just been resolved, and Prussia's access to British naval assistance was curtailed. Not that the Brits were feeling especially helpful. In fact, the newly crowned George III was significantly less committed to supporting the Prussian cause than his predecessor had been. George III immediately suspended financial aid to the beleaguered German state, likely as the first step towards suing for peace. After all, the British had won in the corners of the world where they had fought, so why should it be their problem if their ally couldn't pull its own weight? By now, things were looking grimmer than ever for the Prussians. Exact numbers are hard to find, but by the year's end, the maximum number of troops he had at his disposal was probably around 60,000, who were up against hundreds of thousands of the combined French, Austrian, Russian, and Swedish armies. The hour was late, and the enemies were at the door. It was a foregone conclusion that Berlin would soon be under siege. His only hope, it seemed to him, was the Ottomans. It was a bit of a long shot, to say the least, but Frederick had been making diplomatic overtures to the Sultan for years, and he thought that maybe, just maybe, they would start to bear fruit. They ultimately didn't join, but more than enough happened early in the year for things to remain interesting. 1762 saw two new powers entering the war, a full 8 years after the conflict broke out in North America. Spain's new king, Charles III, hoped to capitalize on the weakness of Portugal, still recovering from the disastrous 1755 Lisbon earthquake. Since Britain was most likely to challenge them in that regard and had important economic and diplomatic ties to Portugal, he was quite receptive to French support to join the war. The French, in return, hoped that the British would either have to divert troops to defend their allies or lose an important source of material and financial support, perhaps alleviating some of the pressure from their most powerful adversary. On January 4th, war between Britain and Spain had begun. The conflict was marked by 3 failed invasions of Portugal by Spanish and French troops throughout the year, each one repulsed by the Lusitanians and their British allies. A number of troops were mobilized in Brazil as well, and the neighboring Spanish colonies in South America, but actual battlefield casualties were very rare, and deaths were almost exclusively a result of disease. As if this turn wasn't stunning enough, Empress Elizabeth of Russia died exactly a day after the war in the peninsula broke out, leaving Russia's commitment to the war effort in doubt. As it turned out, Elizabeth's successor, Peter III, was something of a Frederick fanboy and almost immediately sued for peace despite Russia's highly advantageous position. Frederick, anxious to end hostilities, promptly offered East Prussia to the Russians, but much to the entirety of Europe's surprise, Peter refused. All he wanted was to be given the Order of the Black Eagle, a chivalric honor awarded by the Prussian government. Presumably with a bewildered shrug, Frederick agreed, and Peter placed most of the Russian troops under Frederick's command, who joined the Prussians in the field by June 1762. Sweden, which had only really entered the war opportunistically, simply said, "Nope," and backed out of the war. Meanwhile, Frederick took this opportunity to re-invade Silesia. But the new Russo-Prussian alliance did not last long, as Peter was deposed and killed in a coup organized by his own wife and Frederick's distant cousin, Catherine II, in July. Having successfully Game of Throned her husband, the newly widowed empress withdrew her armies from Central Europe, probably because the plot twists were becoming too unbelievable. Before they left, however, they did help contribute to one more Prussian victory at Burgersdorf, where Frederick allegedly bribed the Russian commander to stay put for a little while. The Austrians under von Daun assumed the Prussians had more fresh troops available and retreated, handing them a victory. France's crushing defeats in India, North America, and Portugal, as well as Austria's in Silesia, had fatally drained both countries' treasuries. Seeing Austrian prospects for the reconquest of Silesia disappear, and suffering under a brutal British blockade, Louis soon sued for peace. The Austrians were not far behind. The official peace treaties would not be signed until the next year, but for all intents and purposes, the 7 Years' War was over. The first of two documents that ended the war was the Treaty of Paris. No, not that one. Nope, yep, that's the one. Signatories of this treaty included Great Britain, France, and Spain, with Portugal being expressly included. Under the terms of the treaty, certain possessions that had been captured during the war, like the many sugar-rich Caribbean islands and part of the African colony of Senegal, were returned to their original owners. Nonetheless, in terms of territory, Britain was the biggest winner. France renounced all claims in India made since 1749. They also gave Britain all territory in North America east of the Mississippi, except New Orleans. That was given to Spain as compensation for Florida, which had in turn also been ceded to Great Britain. Speaking of North America, as we already mentioned, the Native Americans living in eastern Canada and the Ohio Valley now had to deal almost exclusively with the British. Some, like the Micmacs and certain members of the Iroquois Confederacy, felt compelled to ally with them, with many eventually fighting on the British side during the American Revolution. Before eventually aligning with the British, many Native American tribes made war with their new imperial overlords reigning in Ohio in Pontiac's Rebellion, which started in 1763. Hoping to stem the violence, George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763 later that year, thereby forbidding the settlement of lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. The colonists, who had just fought a war in part to take said land from the French, promptly ignored it. In Central Europe, Prussia, Austria, and Saxony signed the Treaty of Hubertusburg 5 days after the Treaty of Paris, bringing an official end to the Silesian theater of war. The terms of peace returned Glatz to Prussia and reconfirmed its control over Silesia in return for the Prussian evacuation of Saxony. The war in this theater had proven that Frederick was an exceptional battlefield commander, and Prussia was a force to be reckoned with, but it also demonstrated it would need strong allies in any future conflict. Austria and Russia, meanwhile, had proven themselves competent military powers that could keep up with Western Europe's finest. A truly global conflict, arguably the first of its kind, the 7 Years' War had a profound impact on the world. Britain's supremacy in both North America and India was solidified, while France began a precipitous decline. We didn't talk much about the conflict in West Africa since it was mostly confined to small British expeditions against wealthy French colonies, but it does emphasize how far-reaching the war was. Battles fought on 4 continents placed an enormous logistical and financial strain on all of the powers involved. The economic woes that ensued are widely seen as a major cause for both the American and French revolutions. The year 1763 may have been the end of the 7 Years' War, but its outcome would reverberate down the centuries and shape the world as we live in today. If you want to learn more about the 7 Years' War, then I highly recommend you watch Professor Daniel M. Cobb's 7 Years' War in Indian Country, which deals with the effects that the outcome of the 7 Years' War had on Native Americans. That lecture is only available on the website of today's sponsor, The Great Courses Plus. The Great Courses Plus is a subscription, on-demand learning service with some of the best lectures and courses from top Ivy League professors. By subscribing, you will gain access to a massive library with over 11,000 video lectures about any academic subject like history, science, math, literature, music, philosophy, and more. Another personal favorite lecture of mine is Professor Gregory S. Alderete's 1759 Quebec Battle for North America, which covers the battle at the Plains of Abraham that I mentioned earlier in this video. We invite you to start your free trial at the Great Courses Plus today by using my link, thegreatcoursesplus.com/thearmchairhistorian, or by clicking the link in the description below.